one of the ways that imposter phenomenon damages people is it isolates them and it makes them feel like they're the only one. And whenever we feel like we're the only one experiencing discomfort, it frightens us and it isolates us and it cuts us off from the very kryptonite of all of that, which is connection, communication, and community.
Someone cares about you.
There's a reason why your heart is beating.
You still have a purpose.
Don't give up.
It's important to know that you're not alone.
You're not alone.
You're not alone.
You are not alone.
Welcome to the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast, where taking a walk can lead to meaningful conversations and new insights. Today, we're thrilled to have RJ Jenkins as our guest. As an esteemed educator and director of education at Columbia University's Center for Veteran Transition and Integration, he has significantly impacted thousands of veteran transitions from active duty into successful college careers and civilian roles. His work extends to building a more inclusive culture in institutions nationwide, enhancing communication and strengthening team resilience. RJ, we are honored to have you on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, as our listeners set their Strava app in motion and step out for their walk, we're eager to delve into what life was like growing up for you in rural Florida.
Well, again, thanks for having me. What a pleasure. Rural Florida. So it's kind of a strange story. I was born in Long Island, New York, to a railroad worker and a cocktail waitress. Who decided to search for a warmer life and moved us to a place called Sarasota, Florida, which if you know Sarasota, that does not sound like rural Florida to you. But all those years ago, I was about 5 years old. So in 1985, there wasn't a whole lot going on. It was a little resort beach town, and we lived inland. So if you know the state of Florida, if you're along the West Coast and you're east of I-75, you're in the middle of nowhere. So we grew up on 5 acres, raised Nubian dairy goats, raised chickens, and grew radishes for the county fair. So I had a lot of just a really cool, kind of wholesome outdoor growing up. You know, we used to take PVC pipes and shove them into ant piles and then fling the dirt at each other growing up. We wore shoes almost never unless we were in school. So that was really cool. But certainly by the time it was time to go to college, I was looking for something almost completely different. I had done well in school. I came from a little bit of a broken home. So certainly school was a place where if I put in the effort, I got the result. If I acted the appropriate way, I got the result. So school was a very affirming place for me, and really excelled at school. And when it was time to go to college, I figured out what's the opposite of a Nubian dairy goat farm? What's the opposite of a place where I'm giving ducklings swimming lessons in the wheelbarrow? And that was New York City. And so the next thing I knew, I woke up one day in 1999 and I was an undergraduate student at Columbia University in the city of New York, studying biological anthropology and English literature.
That's quite a transition from the quintessential Florida man atmosphere. And I'll say that as somebody that was born in Jacksonville, spent a portion of my life in the Milton area. My dad tries to tell me all the time, I am a Floridian, but I don't remember much of the life. But how did you end up at Columbia University then? I help a lot of students every year transition to higher education. And I basically tell them, do this process in the opposite way that I did it, which is I was concerned with one thing, and that was with being in an environment that was essentially the polar opposite, the one that I had grew up in, right? So I was living in a rural community. I was living in a very knowable community. People knew each other, where you went to church, where you bought your groceries, where you got your hair cut. It was a pretty evangelical community. It was a pretty conservative community, a fairly Christian community. I was in the closet at that time, and I kind of was starting to understand that about myself. And so I just knew that what I wanted from college was essentially the opposite thing. And that's not because I didn't love my family. It's not because I didn't have a positive experience in high school, but I was just looking for something different, as so many students are when they move to this next stage. So the truth is,
it was looking like the University of Florida, as it does for so many students who are good at school and want to take advantage of in-state tuition. But I went ahead and threw my hat in the ring at Columbia because it was in New York City. I had an aunt and uncle living on Long Island. And as I always say, like a rat by its tail, Columbia accepted me. I don't know. I'm not sure what boxes I checked for them, but I was good in speech and debate in high school. I was a strong student, and I think I was from a part of the country that they didn't have someone from, so they let me in the door. And I'll tell you, man, it was intense. The leap from high school to Ivy League academics was a wild one. And that first year was really the hardest thing I had ever done, academically, socially, cognitively, psychologically. I mean, it was intense.
And that's so many changes. One, like we're going to look at the environment of Florida to New York. Obviously, there's an environmental change, country to city, so many different stimulants, and then also going through personal changes. That's a lot for anybody to take on and really start to feel out of place. So how did you start to really become successful at this transition and not feel like such, I'm going to coin one of the things that you speak about, an imposter in New York?
Yeah. I remember the first winter I ever experienced in New York. The trees started to lose their leaves. And I said to a buddy of mine, Lucas, I said, they've got to get an arborist out here. These trees have got fungus. They're gonna lose all these trees if they don't get them treated for. They got to get a fungicide on these trees. And he looked at me like I was insane, right? Because of course they're just deciduous trees and they're losing their leaves. And it's not that I didn't know that scientific fact from earth science in 9th grade, but I had never really watched trees lose their leaves before. That was happening to me all the time. Every time I was in class, someone knew something I didn't know, or we were reading a translation and someone knew the original Latin or Greek, or the first time I ever heard someone talk about wintering in a part of the country as a verb, right? That winter wasn't just a season that I knew nothing about. It was also an activity I knew nothing about, right? Where do you winter? Where does your family summer? We had one house. It's where we all lived. I spent my summers taking care of my special needs baby sister, Olivia, so that both of my parents could work full time. I talk all over the place about the first person I ever met at Columbia, a young woman named Ariana, and I met her moving into my dorm room, and she asked me what I did over my summer, and I said I took care of my baby sister, and then I asked her what she did over her summer, and she talked about traveling across Southeast Asia as a classically trained oboe player with the New York International Youth Philharmonic, right? Like, what does a person like me, how do I'm not even sure I really knew what an oboe was, So it felt like every conversation I overheard and every social and cultural fact I encountered, right, they were all kind of crowding around me and whispering to me in unison, "You do not belong here." And even though my professors were saying, "You belong here," and even though my administrators were saying, "You belong here," and even though the admissions committee had said, "Hey, you belong here," it just felt like the structures that were in place and the conversations that were being had were not for someone like me. And to answer your question, what really changed it was one faculty member. I had an English professor named Michael Seidel. He was a Joyce scholar who also did some baseball scholarship. So he would write a book on baseball, and then he'd write a book on Joyce, and then he'd write a book on Mickey Mantle, and then he'd write a book on the modernists. And he was just a super, super down-to-earth working class guy who happened to be smart and became an English professor. And he could tell I was struggling. He could just tell I was quiet. He could tell I was reserved. He could tell I was nervous, right? Because people who feel like imposters in their environment, they're afraid to be found out. We all walk around, we're afraid to be detected. We're afraid to be noticed. Even though we feel invisible, we also feel conspicuous, right? So he just called me out and said, "Hey, come to my office hours." And we got talking. And I was just honest with him about the fact that I felt like I didn't belong. about the fact that I felt both invisible and conspicuous at the same time, all the time, about the fact that I felt like this thing just didn't really feel like it was for someone like me. It didn't feel like I was in class with a bunch of kids whose parents were cocktail waitresses and railroad workers, you know? And the reason it felt like that was because that was true. I mean, I was unique in that way. But it turns out I wasn't as unique as I thought. It turns out most people that I was around were feeling some of those same feelings, maybe not for the same reasons. And he shared with me that that is still how he felt, even as a tenured faculty member at Columbia University. And man, just hearing someone say to me, "You are not broken, and this feeling that you're having is a natural and healthy response to your environment," that's the day it started to change for me.
That's incredible, and I'm so grateful that people like that exist, especially, you know, a professor that was able to recognize what you were going through. They were able to see the background that you came through. You know, for myself personally, I went to I went to 5 different high schools, nearly 18 different schools over my life. I was always the new person, always trying to feel like I belonged no matter where I was living, despite the home conditions that would happen. And then the military starts to reinforce that. You know, we show up and we get thrust into positions that we feel unqualified for. At least I did, and I know a lot of people did. And then as we move up and we start to experience new things that we never thought were possible, it starts to take a toll on our quality of life and stuff like that. And since you were going through this as a young undergrad student, I feel like you're able to empathize with a lot of these people that are going through these transitions. So would you be able to break down a little bit of what it is that we're describing here with this imposter syndrome?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I've had the privilege over the course of my career. I'm now back at Columbia University, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, in kind of a sick twist of fate. The place where I first experienced this thing is now the place where I teach about this thing and talk to students across the country about this thing. So, how cool that the place that taught me what it was has now given me the opportunity to sort of evangelize folks to the fact that they're not broken when they feel this way. So the first thing you'll notice as I talk about it is that I don't actually refer to it as imposter syndrome. And the reason for that is that word syndrome is really pathologizing. And it's not actually the word that the creators of the idea used. They used two academics, 2 women who created the idea, called it imposter phenomenon. And it was referred to imposter phenomenon in the early literature until the collective force of culture kind of pathologized it into imposter syndrome. And we can talk about why I think that happened, but it's essentially imposter phenomenon or imposter feelings are essentially this idea, this sensation that you don't fully belong in an environment, despite evidence that you are deserving and worthy, right? So it's that despite piece that's really important. It's not someone who feels like they don't belong because their environment is giving them messages that they don't belong, right? That's not imposter phenomenon. That's a person who's responding to their environment and can feel both the implicit and explicit ways that that an environment or a system or an institution can say to you, you do not belong here. Imposter phenomenon is different in a subtle way because it's you continuing to feel like you don't deserve to be somewhere despite evidence and affirmation that you are deserving and worthy. So it's kind of a weird thing. And I talk about 5 hallmarks of this thing. One of them being sort of a kind of prevalent undervaluation of the self. The second is a tendency to underplay the value of your own contributions or achievements. The third is this feeling of being conspicuous in your environment or not fully belonging in your environment. This is kind of an important one. The fourth is a tendency to attribute your success to external factors, such as luck or timing or team, rather than internal factors such as skill or talent or work ethic, right? Um, and the fifth is just really sort of this persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. And so these five things sort of mix together, and sometimes people only really resonate with one of them. And sometimes if you're like me, even as I'm doing this podcast with you, you're sort of flirting with all five of them at the same time, right? But these are the sort of big hitter feelings that my imposters report wrestling with most often. And for most of us, one or more of these are present kind of a lot, and so that's when we talk about imposter phenomenon or imposter feelings, that's kind of really the idea or the concept that I'm getting at.
That's really incredible. And as you were listing off these five things, and I was just like, yeah, I downplay a lot of the successes that I had in life and attribute them to chance. I can't believe that these things have happened to me. Who am I to be able to experience this X, Y, and Z? And then also not having a true sense of my own capabilities because I never attributed them to myself. And I think that that's very common, especially with service members who have either spent their entire adult lives in the service or, 4 years coming out of high school. And that was kind of the first job that they took. So in your experience of working with veterans, how does this imposter phenomenon start to manifest in the context of them transitioning into their civilian life, and how can it impact maybe their educational or professional pursuits?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of extraordinary because, I work in higher ed, and we're so conscious in the field of higher education of sort of affinity groups and minority groups. And I don't just mean sort of racial or ethnic minorities, right? But I mean LGBTQ students from historically under-resourced or marginalized backgrounds, students from rural areas, students who transgender students, you name the group of students that have a particular affinity that sort of works to differentiate them from the majority. And this is the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is the work of trying to create more inclusive cultures. And those things, by the way, have become increasingly politicized. And we can talk about that in a different podcast. But, in higher education, we like to think that we're pretty good at this stuff. Military veterans are they're a fascinating piece of this conversation because when people think of them, they think of white men. They think of white men. And of course, we know that veterans are an extraordinarily diverse population. We know that veterans are not all white and not all male. But when we think of the quintessential veteran, we're thinking about a person who's 6'1", 220 pounds of tattoos. And so when that person is saying to you, I feel like I don't belong, I feel both invisible and conspicuous at the same time, I feel like maybe I'm not deserving of this thing, people aren't exactly sure how to respond to that. And of course, add to that for most, veterans are by definition non-traditionally aged students. Veterans are very often coming to school with spouses or families or some sort of parental duties. Veterans are sometimes, not always, but sometimes coming with sort of disability issues or other sorts of wellness concerns, whether or not they're service connected. Veterans are very often, coming from any number of these other affinity groups that we talk about. So, and as I said, they're non-traditionally aged. They're older, right? So talk about feeling conspicuous, right? Talk about feeling like you can't disappear when you're the only 40-year-old person in a room of 18-year-old people. It's extraordinary, right? And this is the thing that fuels imposter phenomenon, right? It's a perception that you are different in some meaningful or material way from the people around you, and it immediately makes you feel like you don't belong there. And And that's really what we see. And so, you're talking to grown people, you're talking to fully constituted men and women who feel really intimidated and afraid to be in these environments. And you have to come up with a vocabulary to help them understand that that thing that they're feeling is completely appropriate. It's not a sign of brokenness. It's not a sign that they don't belong. It is, in fact, something else, right? It's a healthy response to aspiration. It's a healthy response to doing something new, to pushing yourself outside your comfort zone. And once I start to offer that kind of language to the men and women that I work with, I start to see a real shift in their approach to their transition.
That's absolutely insightful what you're talking about with these different groups facing these different challenges as they step into this environment and having to face these challenges that most people wouldn't necessarily recognize that they're facing, and the fact that so many people are going through this sort of imposter phenomenon, especially like surrounding transitions. Whenever we're stepping into something new and we don't have a full idea of what it is that we're encountering. And so, I know a lot of veterans, especially post 9/11 veterans that have spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as some of these generations that have come forward and been more open about their mental health. PTSD and anxiety are issues that I had to wrestle with, and I know a lot of people do have to wrestle with. How does imposter syndrome kind of intersect with issues such as these mental health conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'll be clear. I'm not a licensed physician. I'm not a licensed mental health professional, but I have to say that, I think part of the issue here for me is that imposter phenomenon, again, commonly referred to as imposter syndrome. I'm going to break you of that habit by the end of this podcast.
Thank you.
You're good. But I think it's important for people to hear you say it, because this is how ingrained this idea is for us, right? This is how culture is speaking about these feelings so aggressively and assertively that it's almost impossible to step out of the syndrome language. And I think it's language like syndrome that makes us think that there are stronger connections between things like this and anxiety and depression than there might be. My answer is this, and again, it's not a clinical answer, but it's an observational answer based on thousands of interactions and conversations with this population. I think the belief that imposter feelings are bad are contributing to anxiety and depression, not the imposter feelings themselves, right? The imposter feelings themselves are natural, organic, healthy responses to aspiration and striving. It is the belief that imposter feelings are bad. It is the belief that someone who experiences imposter feelings are somehow broken. It's that perception that I think can contribute to feelings of anxiety and depression. So what's wild about this is that it's not the feelings themselves that are causing the problem. It's our belief that the feelings are bad that is causing our problem. If you ever feel like treating yourself to a wonderful TED Talk, Kelly McGonigal is a stress therapist and psychologist. I believe she's at Stanford University, and she has a wonderful TED Talk that doesn't have a great title called How to Make Stress Your Friend. She makes the same argument that it's not the stress response that causes health issues. It's our deep-seated belief that stress is always already harmful that is actually harming us. And I've taken some of Professor McGonagall, for those of you Harry Potter fans out there, you're welcome. I've taken Professor McGonagall's structure around our perceptions of stress being the thing that harm us, and I've sort of applied it to this imposter feelings model, right? What's wild is that I think there's an entire generation of people out there who have been harmed by what they've been told about these things. And so much of my work is about trying to repair that framing. I think what we need is a reframe here. Imagine a world in which you felt like you didn't belong in a place, even though you had signs all around you that you were deserving of being there. And your response to feeling like you didn't belong was, wow, I guess I'm I guess I'm growing, right? In other words, what if your response to imposter feelings was the same as your response to being sore after a good workout? When you work really hard at the gym and you come home sore, you don't think, man, I'm broken. You think, wow, I'm getting stronger. And I would love to see that kind of a physiological understanding of discomfort applied a little bit more to some of these feelings of discomfort that we have in other aspiring or striving scenarios.
That is so good. And thank you for highlighting. I'm glad that I made the mistake of saying syndrome again, because it's very clear that this fight against identifying a condition with ourselves, with our psyche, is crucial to overcome. I know with, we're even trying to change the language around PTSD. It's not a disorder. It's not necessarily something. It's our response to repeated traumas and repeated stressors of an intense nature. Obviously, the more that we accumulate, the more difficult the recovery can be. But there is a process to overcome. And so I really appreciate your outrightness to come out and say, hey, this isn't a syndrome. This isn't something that is a prolonged effect, because that can stunt our progress in the world and our capabilities of moving forward. And then that response to stress, when I tell people, like, stress kind of drives me in a lot of the stuff that I do. It helps me wake up in the morning and exercise. It helps me get a job done at work. Sometimes I take on too many stressors at once, and a lot of us do that. And that's when it starts to become negative, because we're not counteracting that. What strategies or resources have you found to be effective in helping overcome this phenomenon and build confidences in your students and those around you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, there are a couple main things, right? One is again, and I hate to beat a dead horse, but it's the shift in language that I think can be extraordinarily helpful. People listen and they look, and if you Google imposter phenomenon, let's say you ditched syndrome, and then you went to the Google machine and you typed in imposter phenomenon because you were feeling a little out of place in a new job, or you were feeling a little out of place in your new school. I mean, the language scape that surrounds this concept online and in culture is unbelievable, right? How to cure imposter syndrome, how to beat imposter syndrome, how to battle imposter syndrome, tactics to defeat imposter syndrome. I mean, it's extraordinary. There are even military metaphors, right, employed to think about this thing that's a completely natural thing, right? So the first thing I really would love to see mentors, advisors, institutions do is to shift their language around the concept. The second is to make sure that conversations like this are happening, right? If you go back to the beginning of our conversation, the thing that started the change for me was someone saying to me, I see you and I understand what you're feeling because I have felt it. One of the ways that imposter phenomenon damages people is it isolates them. And it makes them feel like they're the only one. And whenever we feel like we're the only one experiencing discomfort, it frightens us and it isolates us and it cuts us off from the very kryptonite of all of that, which is connection, communication, and community, right? So the second thing is to do exactly what y'all are doing, which is to talk about this thing. The third thing I'll say about military veterans in particular, military connected students, and I want to shout this from every rooftop and every mountaintop that there is, because one of the big reasons in that specific environment that imposter phenomenon exists with such intensity is that there is this belief among many of my veterans that what they did in the military can't possibly help them in school. How could disarming bombs or fixing tanks or shooting things from far away or forecasting the weather, how could any of those things help me be good at college algebra, right? Like the connection between the military skill set and the skill set of a student or the skill set of an employee, it's hard for folks to make that connection. So they think, how can I possibly do this? And my answer is simple. And this is another one of those conversations where I can see it click for people. What is the one skill set that every single veteran has? I've worked with thousands of veterans over the course of 2 decades. What is the number one skill they all have? They have many, many skills, but the one skill they all have in common is that every single veteran, by virtue of being a veteran, has already proven that they have the ability to become good at things that they weren't already good at. I'm going to say it again for the people in the back of the room, okay? Every single veteran, no matter what they did, no matter what their job was, no matter what their branch was, they have all proven by virtue of being in the military, they have already proven that they have the ability to become good at something that they weren't already good at. That is the most transferable skill in the galaxy. So all school is, and all work is learning to become good at things that you aren't already good at. And just like in the gym, learning to get good at things often involves a certain amount of discomfort, because the discomfort is a sign of growth. So once we can kind of embrace the notion that a certain amount of discomfort is part of the process, we start to overcome this stigma that somehow we're just not good enough, or we're not cut out for it, or it's not meant for us. It absolutely is meant for you, and you've already proven that you can do it in a different context. And I don't know, that conversation seems to wake people up a little bit. We have all of these systems in place in universities: academic support and wellness support and mental health support and financial support. But I have to tell you, none of those support structures are going to help if a person believes deep down that they don't deserve any of it, right? You've got to do that first, and then the rest can follow.
That's amazing. Everybody go back and just listen to some of the stuff that he just said, because I can't even summarize. The first one I'm going to mention is talking about these things, either with a mentor, a close friend, or just peers. One of the things that has frustrated me becoming an adult and trying to figure out how to balance my own budget is people's guardedness over talking about some of the hard things of like how much money they earn and how do they make a living in an expensive place, right? Because we can sit there and struggle and not recognize that other people around us are going through the same thing, and maybe they have tools to get us to the next place, or maybe we can partner up and get to the next place together. And that's a lot of transitions. That's a lot of hard things in life, whether it's marriage, money, religion, politics, whatever it is, having those healthy, open, and safe conversations that people don't shirk away from and get offended about, but open up about and say, hey, I'm going through this. Oh, chances are, what did teachers used to say? Like, if you have a question, ask it, because the chances of somebody else having that exact same question in the room are extremely high.
100%. And not only that, but let's not just create the safe spaces for these conversations. Let's model a certain amount of vulnerability as a way of doing business, right? I mean, that teacher who said to me, I see you because I know, because I experience it every day. That's the magic, right? That's the magic wand. That's the incantation. When you as a mentor, when you as an advisor, when you as a teacher, when you as an employer, when you as a parent, as a spouse, say to someone else, I see you not because I sympathize. I see you because I empathize. That's the real safe space. The safe space is modeling the vulnerability. And that doesn't mean that we all need to, hold each other and braid each other's hair all day long. But what it does mean is let's recast leadership and mentorship as something that's not just about strengths first. Let's also be transparent about what's hard.
Absolutely. Institutions that model this type of vulnerability are some of the strongest in the world, where they sit there and they say, hey, our employees can talk about anything. Our students can talk about anything and bring it to light. Like, that's one of the reasons that a lot of educational institutions are such powerful places, because people are working through these young adults under the guided supervision of insightful professors and staff, are working through complex problems at critical portions in our lives. And that level of vulnerability only makes us stronger. It doesn't mean that we're breaking down because I had a bad day or because this is hard. Like you had mentioned, the gym, you tell your buddy when you're at your max. If not, you're going to drop the barbell and injure yourself. And so, be willing to have somebody help you get that last rep.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Now, for yourself, you are spreading this message everywhere. We encountered you at the Military Influencer Conference back in November of 2023, speaking on the imposter phenomenon. What are some of the things that you do to balance your job, your social life, and getting out there and speaking?
I just I embrace the suck. When it sucks, you'll remember this wonderful moment, this Tom Hanks quote from A League of Their Own, right? About the hard is what makes it great, right? So there's a certain amount of suck to trying to balance all of the things in life. But for me, I'll be honest, it's about, I just gave a presentation this morning at our community foundation here in Ocala, talking to a bunch of colleague nonprofits about things that we should be thinking about as we start the year. And the first slide in my presentation was a sentence in front of 30 of my colleagues that said, "I'm really bad at this." And it was me admitting to the room that all of these things that I'm about to say are not things that I'm naturally gifted at or that come easy for me. They're all things that are difficult for me. And whenever you want to learn how to do something, don't go to someone who says, "Oh yeah, it's never been hard for me." Right? Go to the person who's had to learn how to do whatever it is you're trying to learn, right? So one of the ways that I keep balance, to the extent that I keep it, is I'm just real honest with myself and those around me about where I fall down, where I need help. I build a team around me of people who can step in and help lift. And I've just gotten past. I'm in my early 40s. My 20s were for thinking I could do everything. My 30s were for realizing that I couldn't. And now my 40s are about figuring out how to lean into the people around me to move forward and get the things done that I want to do. And one of the big ticket items is I no longer wrestle with the notion that feeling like I'm not enough sometimes makes me broken or bad. Instead, feeling like I'm not enough sometimes is a completely natural part of the process. Being able to shed that cognitive burden has been super, super liberating. And that's my message. I have a TED Talk out there about this topic. I'm on the conference circuit talking to as many people as I can, changing syndrome to phenomenon, changing syndrome to feelings, and just trying to liberate people from what I think is a really damaging paradigm, and saying there's a different way to think about this thing, and it can really help in all areas of your life, including your marriage. Some days I just feel like I'm not the best at my marriage. Do you want to know why? Because some days I'm not the best at my marriage, and that, like, okay, so let's embrace that. And instead of being broken, let's have a conversation about the next right thing. And that's just kind of how I move forward.
That's absolutely wonderful. And I love the different stages of life because they repeat for every single generation. So many people go through these cycles of, I tell parents, I'm not a parent myself, but I remember my life with my father. He tried teaching me when I was a kid. I told him I knew everything when I was a young adult. And then somewhere around 28 to 30, I turned back and said, "Dad, I need your support and advice again." And he freely gave it. There are things in our lives that are cyclical. And I know with the ongoing struggles that a lot of veterans and people in general face, the tragic rise of suicide in our country, especially among service members and veterans, continues to climb. So what message of hope would you have for somebody that is currently battling with those thoughts, feelings, or emotions?
Yeah. One, I've had them. So let's just call that what it is, right? I've had them. I don't know if I know anyone who I trust or who I love who hasn't had them. And that's not to say that they're not special or unique to each person, but I'm also tired of the idea that only this tiny subset of people think about these things. I'm done with that. It's not that we all spend all of our days thinking about these things, but I have spent moments in my life where I had real questions about whether or not I wanted to keep going. So one, I think I know something about that in a small way. And two, you're not alone. I said earlier in the conversation, what happens with these feelings is they isolate us and they cut us off from our sources of support. And so I think, that looks different for every person, but you're not by yourself. You're not the only person who's ever experienced something like this. And usually there's help nearby. Usually there's a person or more than one more than one person who's right around the corner, ready to listen. And knowing that I'm not by myself when I'm in a dark spot usually shines some light. It usually disperses the darkness a little bit. The more alone I feel, the darker the darkness feels. And as soon as someone's with me, as soon as someone's holding my hand, as soon as I'm sitting next to someone, as soon as I'm on the phone, that darkness starts to recede a little bit. And so I just try to be real tuned into that. And that's my message of hope is we're not alone out there struggling with these things.
Thank you so much for that, RJ. Suicide, you're right. Suicide is not just an isolated incident amongst a select few. It is not only a national, but an international epidemic that affects all people in all walks of life. So you are right. People are not alone. And speaking of which, where can people find and connect with you to continue to hear some of your insight and knowledge?
Yeah, the best way for people to connect with me, and again, I just want to thank you so much for giving me a little bit of a platform to talk about some of these ideas that I'm so obsessed with. I work for the Columbia University Center for Veteran Transition and Integration. That's a very, very long title. The best way to find me is to Google Jenkins, Jenkins CVTI, and I'll pop right up on the Google machine. And my contact information lives there and people can reach out to me that way. And I'm happy to give just about anybody my phone number so that we can hop on the phone and talk more.
That's amazing. RJ, your journey from rural Florida to Columbia University and your work with veterans and people changing the conversation around imposter phenomenon is truly inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences with us here on the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing for opening up these conversations for folks.
Absolutely. And also remember, audience, to catch the 1 Mile, 1 Veteran podcast on Wreaths Across America Radio, available on iHeartRadio, Odyssey, and the TuneIn app.